This episode is brought to you by Oberle Risk Strategies, the insurance brokerage and insurance diligence provider that's been trusted by investors, lenders, searchers, and CEOs for over a decade now. The company is led by August Felker, himself a two-time searcher within both the funded and the self-funded models. He personally runs Oberle's dedicated search fund practice that works with searchers across the entire diligence, purchase, and post-close process. Their diligence offering, which is completely free, by the way, will assess your target company's insurance program and will summarize any potential coverage gaps, the pro forma insurance pricing, and any changes needed for closing or shortly thereafter. In 9 out of every 10 client engagements, they're able to either reduce spend or improve coverage, all in such a way that the searcher or CEO can focus on other things while Oberle handles all things insurance for them. Oberle has serviced over 900 customers across a decade of operation and has an NPS score that puts them at the very top of their industry. But don't take my word for it. Click on the hyperlink located within today's episode description, and we will gladly put you in touch with as many happy Oberle customers as you'd like. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of In the Trenches. I am your host, as always, Steve Davidkos. At least in my opinion, today's episode is an incredibly special one, and one that I am very proud to bring to you. As a searcher and CEO myself between 2012 and 2020, I vividly recall attending many of the ETA conferences and leaving with a feeling of self-doubt, self-consciousness, or insecurity. It seemed like everybody knew more than I did, they were moving faster than I was, or more certain in their decisions. In short, it kind of felt like everybody had it all figured out except for me. And of course, this wasn't deliberate on the part of the conference organizers. They were simply celebrating successes as they should have been and trying to share with others the lessons that led to those successes. I suppose an unintended consequence of these efforts, though, is that it's easy for attendees to leave feeling as if everybody else in the room is a smashing success except for them. But empirically, we know that this simply isn't true. According to the most recent data published by Stanford, 37% of all search funds wind down without acquiring a company, and this number appears to be rising. Of the 63% who do acquire a company, 31% of them sell at a loss. So clearly, in spite of external appearances, not everybody is a smashing success. Today's guest, Jed Morris, has been incredibly generous, vulnerable, and forthright about the challenges that he faced as a searcher and CEO. In his own words, after the bankruptcy of his company, he experienced homelessness, a profound sense of shame and failure, and nearly lost his marriage. Since then, however, his courage has helped an untold number of entrepreneurs either persist through similar circumstances or avoid them entirely. To me, Jed is somebody who demonstrates what true leadership looks like. The point of today's conversation is not necessarily to scare people away from taking this path, nor is it to suggest that it's necessarily likely to happen to you. Instead, what I really took from this conversation is the fact that sometimes even the worst case scenario is still one that we can not only survive, but learn from, grow from, and share with others. One of my favorite quotes is, "Your superpower very often sits right next to your biggest wound." In our conversation today, I think it's pretty darn clear that Jed has successfully turned his biggest wound into his most admirable superpower. Before we dive into today's episode, allow me to conclude with my usual reminder that I'm an active investor in search funds and the companies that they acquire through our firm, Mineola Search Partners. And if you tuned in to the brief episode that we published last month, you'll be familiar with the fact that we just concluded the first close for Mineola's second fund that will again be investing in search funds and the small businesses that they acquire. So if you're looking to raise a search fund yourself, I would welcome the opportunity to speak with you. But for now, I hope you enjoy today's conversation with Jed Morris. Jed Morris, welcome to the show.
Steve, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here. I've been following your story, albeit from a bit of a distance, but I have been following your story for the past year or two. And I will say that I really admire what you're doing. I really admire your honesty, your candor, your humility. And now it seems like you are trying your best to pay it forward and help the next generation of acquisition entrepreneurs learn from your journey. So, I guess on behalf
Yeah.
of everybody listening, thank you for enlightening us and sharing your story with us. And actually, your story is largely what we're going to talk about today. But maybe before we get there, we can just start from the beginning. If you could just tell us a bit more about yourself, your upbringing, what you did prior to business school, and how the heck you ended up with the idea of trying to buy a company.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Steve. I never intended this to be the story, but now that it is, I've come front and center with how it can potentially help other people because unfortunately, business failure happens to a lot more than we'd like to admit, especially in the ETA space. So,
Yes.
well, long before I ever decided to buy a company, I'm originally from Georgia, went to college in Nebraska. Long story short, joined the Air Force. I was one of those guys who, didn't really have a plan, and my GPA did not reflect someone who had a plan, and so. I came to this realization, was like, I got to do something. I didn't want to just be a bartender forever or be a server forever. So I joined the Air Force. Never planned to stay there. I figured if I hate every minute of it, then, at least I'll get my GI Bill. And it turns out I really liked it. I stayed for 10 years. So I was in active duty doing financial management, acquisition. Started off at the base level. Ultimately, I was at the Pentagon and in the DC area working on these large, top secret, multi-billion dollar projects with our big prime contractors. So it was quite the journey. A couple of deployments mixed in there. Met my wife throughout that process. And I tell people all the time, look, I mean, the military will give you everything you need to succeed or fail. It's up to you to decide how you're going to take advantage of those resources. But in 2019, I finally made the decision to get out because I was right at that 10-year mark. And so if you're in, 10 years is the decision point. Are you going to stay in and go for 20 or are you going to get out today? Because there's really no break after that. And so I decided to get out. Didn't really have a plan of what I wanted to do, but wanted to try something different. And I, like most people without a plan, luckily stumbled into an MBA program. I went to NYU Stern. I actually went to their executive program that's based out of DC because that's where I got out while I was in the Air Force and absolutely loved it. It was an incredible opportunity, learned a lot about a lot, and got recruited by Microsoft at the time. So I was able to go work in at Microsoft again on their top secret division, working on building out the cloud. So it was like when Jedi Cloud was all over the news. So we were building out the cloud for a lot of our defense contractors. Stayed in big tech for a while, but to the crux of your question, how does all of this translate into going to buy a company? And it was the second semester at NYU. I'm going through entrepreneurial finance, one of the courses there. And NYU, this is 2020 to 2021. So, buying a business was not cool online. There were not these influencers were not there. So, and there were only really, three ETA conferences. It was Chicago, Harvard, and Stanford. And so
Yeah.
there was no information out there whatsoever. And so I was reading through a textbook on entrepreneurial finance, and I remember it was chapter 3, and it just glancingly talked about small business multiples. And I don't know why, but something clicked. I was like, people are buying these things? That doesn't make any sense. And they were talking more middle market, anything like 20 to 70 million enterprise value, not the real tiny stuff. But it just sparked this interest. And I read that entire book in about 2 days. And then that led to, going down the rabbit hole and finding out about the Harvard conference, which I attended that fall, and then the Chicago conference, which I attended right after that. And man, I was drinking the Kool-Aid hard. I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is really neat. How are not more people doing this? Right. And from that moment, I did not quit my job. I stayed in big, but I started searching on the side, kind of putting the pieces together, reaching out to other searchers who had done it successfully, and just kind of figuring out how you do this whole thing. And yeah, dove right into reading Sims and figuring out how to search.
So you learn about the ETA model, you immerse yourself in the community, you educate yourself on the idea. You mentioned that you started searching, off the side of your desk, so to speak. Can you just walk
Yeah.
us through your search process? Did it remain off the side of your desk, or did you eventually pivot to full time? How long did it take? And if you could just walk us through some of the nuances of like the types of companies, the types of industries you targeted. Maybe let's start there.
Yeah, the total search time was about a year and a half, and at no point did I ever quit my job. But I will
Hmm.
say, towards the second half of that, I was working at another big tech company, and I was heavily underutilized. So I was getting paid a full-time salary, but maybe doing, I mean, maybe 10 hours of work a week. So I was effectively searching almost full-time, and so
Yeah.
that was a huge benefit. But up until that point, I was just searching on the side, and I highly recommend that to everybody. I'm like, that's your startup seed capital. Um, so that's how it kind of started. And originally, I started looking in defense contracting because all my background is in defense contracting. I did 10 years in the Air Force working on the federal side of it, but I understand GovCon quite well, working with our government contractors. And then after being at in big tech and Microsoft and Amazon, I learned how to code. I learned how the cloud was built. And I got really fascinated with that. And so I was like, where can I find this nice intersection between emerging tech or even legacy enterprise software and government contracting? And the good news is that that absolutely does exist. The bad news is that, as a brand new searcher, yeah, I only saw the little funnel, that I could see, which was self-funded search. And so I
Right.
was like, wow, there's really nothing I can buy in this space with an SBA loan, right? Um, and that's my impression. And there probably are a few things I could have bought, but for the first maybe 6 to 8 months, I didn't find anything within that range. And so, I thought I was like, well, how do I pivot out of this and find something that I actually can buy? And that's where I kind of went right back to the drawing board, reading through the HBR guide and saying, all right, well, let me find one of these service-based businesses, something I can actually do pretty well. And I just happened to stumble across a landscaping company. I met an owner, really nice guy, got to know him, and then pivoted my whole search into landscaping just because I met him and got kind of fascinated with the space.
Can you talk to us about what specifically about landscaping appealed to you and why you thought that would be an ideal fit, A, for like the search fund model more
Yeah.
broadly, but also B, for you at a personal level?
Yeah. At a personal level, I can't really answer that question because I have no idea. I have no background there. I don't have a license in it. I've never worked in landscaping. And I think the only thing what drew me to it were the metrics. It's highly fragmented. It's highly recurring revenue. It's very consistent. I can find it all over the country. And so I found an industry where there's a lot of mom and pops and then really nothing in the middle. And then a lot of the big companies like the Bright Views of the world. And so it very much lent itself to this M&A model where it's like, well, if I can, piece together a few of these mom and pops, then I've got something actually kind of compelling. And so
Right.
the industry and the metrics and the numbers made sense to me. But from a personal standpoint, I can't tell you there was anything personally where I was like, wow, I would do really well here. I was, like a lot of, new searchers, I was just fascinated by the numbers and the metrics and the model. I wasn't really thinking, do I really want to run a landscaping company for the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah.
The only thing that was really, I guess constraining my thought process was it had to be in Southern California because that was
Okay.
where home was for me. I originally started looking nationally, but then I did constrict back to Southern California. And so I kind of like circled back you know, to landscaping. And I was like, oh, this is pretty neat. It was something where I was like, you kind of have to buy your customers because they're so sticky and they're so entrenched. And the vast
Yeah.
majority of these, mom and pops simply weren't doing that.
So fair to say that your investment thesis was quite uh, acquisitive in nature, meaning that the plan from day one was always to buy this platform, meaning like your first landscaping business, and thereafter to start acquiring additional landscaping businesses to bolt onto that.
Yeah, I had teamed up with a partner from business school, and the thought was, why can't we find like probably really good companies that are just in the suburbs of like major cities, right? So they haven't been, rolled into like the large primes yet, but it's something that is very compelling, very good. It's got a great brand. That was always going to be the most important piece. And the thesis was, a lot like, when you go to a grocery store and you walk down the aisle and you see like 18 different versions of ketchup and like 16 of them are all owned by, Kroger or Kellogg or, somebody who owns the back end, but all the brands are different, right? And so that was the thought process there. I was like, well, what if we actually just build like kind of a hold co model where we acquire really good brands in at these outskirts. We centralize the things that, the back end stuff, and then we keep the front the same. Because I don't want to have like one name, one label. I want to make sure that it's highly brandable in the local community. And that thesis made sense to me at the time. It made sense to my partner at the time. We raised a couple $100,000 from friends and family and business school classmates, and then we went out and tried to make that happen.
So take us into the acquisition process itself. If you are comfortable doing so, sharing a little bit about the company that you acquired, and maybe just walk us through
Yeah.
that first, handful of months as a new CEO.
Yeah. Well, like a lot of people, I had a few broken deals before I actually had one that did close. And unfortunately, one of those broken deals was definitely the one that got away. It was this wonderful company in Texas. And, we weren't able to get across the finish line. And that experience led my partner to decide to take a job working in a government contracting firm, which, to be fair, was a really good move for her. And so that fundamentally changed my thesis. Like, all right, well, now I need to find something just in Southern California because I had no plans of moving away. And so I started looking in the area. I'd already been kind of farming a few places, maybe Orange County, even as far north as LA, but definitely in San Diego County. And then I found a couple landscaping owners here in San Diego County that I got to know. One specifically that I really liked, a really wonderful guy who had been running a company for about 40 years. And one thing led to another. The conversation kind of kicked off. And it wasn't particularly large company. They were doing, I mean, just under 2 million in top line revenue,
Okay.
but they had been in business for 40 years and they were entirely residential and project based. They had been licensed for decades. And I remember asking him one time, I was like, what can't you build? And he's like, an airport. I can build pretty much everything but an airport, you know? And so, I started really thinking through this. And um, the biggest thing for me was the brand. Like by his company, he'd been running it for so long, um, and he had been putting like most small contractors very little effort into the front side of the business. So the website was trash, the operations were not great, but he was a natural salesman, and so and their team was fantastic. So the reviews were great. I mean, just 4.9 on Google and maybe 100 over 40 years. And for most landscaping companies, that's incredible. And so the brand name was really good. And so we started talking, really built a great relationship, and ultimately came to a decision to buy that company. And the way we did it, though, was because it was so small, I brought the capital I had raised, put capital down, and then the rest of it, instead of taking the SBA loan, I just did a seller's note. But I personally guaranteed the seller's note.
Interesting. So, how soon after you acquired this first business did you start looking for the second business to acquire?
Yeah, I had never stopped looking. I had been looking the entire time and building a pipeline. And so what had happened, and I caution other searchers about this, is that, when you're looking, it feels like no one's paying attention to you. It feels like you're fighting to get that interview. It feels like you're trying to build your pipeline and no one can hear you. No one takes you seriously. But then the moment you buy a company, now everybody takes you seriously. All the business brokers take you seriously.
Right.
The owners take you seriously. Word spreads fast. And what I did not expect was the moment I'd already been, building the pipeline, but the moment I'd bought the first company, you know, these owners, especially in a geographical area, they all know each other. Their employees all
Right.
know each other. They all get the supplies from the same places. A lot of them went to high school together. Like, in fact, the gentleman that I bought his company, his wife was actually a secretary for the owner of the second company at one point, like 30 years ago. And so, like, they all knew each other. And I say all that to say that, like, right after the first company closed, word spread fast. Like, oh, this guy sold his company, and then hands just started going up. There were like four or five others who reached out, like, "Hey, that you're buying? I might be interested in selling."
Yeah.
And I got tipped off to the company number two. And so, to answer your question, I actually bought company number two about 35 days after company number one. So very
Interesting.
fast.
Okay. So you are inside company number one. 35 days later, you acquire company number two. Tell us what happened after that, because my understanding of your story and your journey is that's the point at which some difficulties started to present themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, total disaster. And so if I had just stayed with company number one, we would not be having this conversation right now. Company number one was very well put together, very, very profitable, very low debt service, wonderful relationship with the seller. But what happened was that, and all of this comes back to my naivete, my inexperience, um, my pride, of thinking that I knew more than I did. And I caution people, I'm like, look, you may know enough to be dangerous, but probably not enough to be as humble as you should. And that was definitely where I fell in. Because once all those indications of interest went up, what became, an initial $2 million top line acquisition quickly turned into the possibility of like 17 top line. I could really consolidate within a local area, all these companies within 30 miles of each other. And so, as you can imagine, the numbers and spreadsheets in my head just exploded. I was like, oh my God, this is a unique opportunity. I need to move quickly because it may not be here in the future. And I look back,
Right.
I'm like, if I just pumped the brakes and waited maybe 12 months and built the relationships, like I still could have done all of that, but done it at a much more sustained step. But of course, that's not what I'm thinking. And so I dove into company number two very quickly. And I did all the diligence myself for the legal diligence. The one thing that I did very, very well is that I found a legal team that I knew very well, that understood my process, that I trusted completely. And they did all my documentation. That's the one thing I did very, very good. The rest of it, again, I knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to know where I should have gotten more help. And so I did the financial diligence myself. I'm thinking, this company's doing 2 million top line. I can do that. I've got an MBA. I can handle that. And the owners were very, acquiescent. They were giving me their access to the accounting systems. Like I felt like I had full access to everything I needed to see. And so
Yeah.
I got comfortable with it very quickly. The second acquisition, I basically used the same formula I used on the first: a cash down payment and then a personally guaranteed seller's note on the back end. And that was one of the things I ran into, and people ask, well, why did you personally guarantee the seller's note? And because the sellers would ask, how do I know this is going to be legitimate? And in my mind, there wasn't really a good answer for that. There wasn't really a good answer for that other than saying, all right, well, we'll personally guarantee the seller's note. And so that's why I went ahead and did that. And so second business comes in, and, other than fully misunderstanding, the amount of capital required when you start merging companies together, the culture conflicts you have when you start merging companies together, the customer issues you have when you start merging companies together. So like from a strategic perspective, what I thought would happen actually happened. Company number one was very project based, a lot of construction and residential experience. Company number two was entirely commercial, a lot of recurring revenue, a lot of blow, cut and blow type work. And so I thought, well, company number two, because they have all these recurring contracts and they're really great at the commercial work, well, their margins are much, much smaller because of that kind of work. But they've got a lot more consistency. And whenever they need extra work done, they have to contract that out through other teams. So like, well, company number one can be that other team. We can double dip on that. And that ended up being true. Like the synergies, if you want to use the word, that it was there. But the
Yeah.
problem, came down to, first and foremost, my inexperience. And then second, culture clashes, very much a lack of, liquid capital to keep things moving. I got a crash course in what the cash conversion cycle actually means beyond working capital when you're doing an initial analysis. And so, especially in a capex heavy kind of business where trucks break every week, equipment is shutting down every week, and so it very, very quickly went south. Within 3 weeks, it started going south. Most of our cash that I had in for working capital was drained within 2.5 weeks. And at that point, it was all hands on deck. I was like, what can I do to kind of keep this thing moving and, get our customers to pay a little faster, make sure that we're getting prepayments up front and all these things that ultimately end up being the end of the company.
So, a handful of weeks into your second acquisition, you mentioned that challenges started to present themselves. There were cash challenges, there were challenges with the diligence process, etc. Maybe take us through to the conclusion of the story, kind of what ended up
Yeah.
happening from a commercial standpoint and what ended up happening from just a final outcome standpoint.
Yeah. So when it comes to challenges with the companies overall, there's some things I can say and there's some things I can't. And this is one of the reasons why you don't hear a lot of these stories online, is because when things do go south, there's usually some sort of there's a lawsuit, there's a settlement, there's a non-disclosure, non-disparagement agreement. I applaud all those things. And so while I can't get into specific details of how, what really drove business number two, I can say in broad strokes, there are three things you really need to watch out for. Three big lessons learned for me. Number one, the business is always a direct reflection of its owner, period, bar none. So the owner dictates the culture of the company. And sometimes you get in there like I did and you think, oh, well, I don't really need to worry too much about culture. The owner is leaving tomorrow. I can overlook a few things. I'm really just buying the customer list. I'm really just integrating, the business operations. Uh, you know, danger, Will Robinson. That is a horrible way to go about it, because what you'll find is that there's a level of toxicity below a unscrupulous owner. What you'll find is that a lot of times there's meddling in place, and you find out people will sign anything on a purchase agreement, but does that mean they're actually going to do it? And like a lot of searchers, I had this unrealistic faith in the legal system. Like, well, they signed a contract, they could never do that, and if they did, I would sue them. And then you start looking at what it costs to sue someone, you're like, oh, that's why they did it, because they know that I can't do anything about it. And
Yeah.
it's like, you start running into all these barriers. And so like I tell people, look, issue number one is the seller is always the biggest risk in your deal, hands down. if they want to, they can absolutely screw up your deal in a way that you cannot recover from. And so, take culture very seriously. The numbers and the finances have to be there for the deal to work, but it's absolutely the seller and the culture of the business that determine whether or not you're successful. And that's
Yeah.
always issue number one. But issue number two, very, very close behind it, is cash flow. If you don't understand the cash conversion cycle, you are going to drown. It is the oxygen in these small businesses. And that was one of the things I did not understand. Like a lot of first time buyers, I got pretty good with the formulas. I was like, oh, I can factor in and determine working capital. I know if we're doing okay. I know if we're doing X, Y, and Z. But I never actually took the time to say, all right, well, what does our accounts receivable look like? How long does it actually take to collect? And then as it comes through the company, how much time do we actually get to hold on that cash before it pays out? What does that total time of cash conversion look like? And in
Yeah.
landscaping, especially in somewhere like California, you're incredibly hamstrung when it comes to cash flow. By law, we're not allowed to charge the entire project up front. We have to go in partial payments. And then even then, well, are your customers even going to pay on time? And so there's a lot, and we have to put, the entire output, we have to buy all the materials and the costs all up front. And so there's this huge outlay of cash flow in the beginning to get a project underway, but you're only taking partial payments until you actually get paid. And you're looking anywhere from like a 6 to a 15% net profit margin. So things get really tight really fast. And you think you're doing well because you're selling bigger and bigger deals, when in reality, you're just driving yourself into bankruptcy. And if you don't
Right.
know that, like I didn't, then, not only you're dealing with all the other issues, but your cash just keeps dwindling and dwindling and dwindling until the point to where a truck breaks and you're like, well, I can't even fix that truck. You start driving to your customers, hey, I need a check because I need to fix my truck.
So many interesting lessons and
Yeah.
so many follow-ups I have for you. Before we get into like the
Yeah.
nitty-gritty operational questions and lessons, can we go back to the diligence and transaction process? Because you alluded to the fact that
Yeah.
there's a bunch of stuff that you would do differently, knowing what you know now. Can
Oh,
you just
yeah.
talk about what some of those things are?
Yeah. Thing number one, first time buyers always discuss whether or not it makes sense to get equality of earnings. Repeat buyers never do. They always get it every single time, no matter what. And so that is a huge lesson learned. There's a reason why Q of E's, they do what they do. It's because even with all the experience in the world, even if you have a CPA, if you're not somebody who actually does Q of E's normally, there's going to be things you don't even know to look for, things that you're going to miss. I look back on these acquisitions, and I can't tell you how many postmortems I've done, on paper and in my mind on this. But like, what did I truly mess up on? And what should I have learned from? And then what things were outside of my control? And what I find is that over and over and over, there was my Q of E analysis, overall, I was kind of like 90% there. But that 10% I missed was the death nail. If I'd
Yeah.
done a Q of E, especially on business number two, I never would have bought it. And so, and people are like, well, Q of E could be, 15 grand, and you're buying like, maybe a $2 million company that's got maybe like, $400,000 of SDE. Is it even worth it? I'm like, yeah. Have you seen the return on that? Like, where else could like, if you're looking to buy a $4 million company top line as your purchase price, and I'm going to charge you, 15, $20,000 for a Q of E, within 2 weeks, I'm getting like an 18,000% return on my money.
Yeah.
18,000% return of knowing against that 4 million that I either did not personally guarantee in debt, or I now have a very thorough understanding of my company. So that's issue number one. It blows my mind how anyone looks at anything and says, oh, well, I probably don't need a Q of E. I think the only time you probably can get away with that argument is if the transaction is so small that you could default on it and it's not a big deal for you. Like
Hmm.
maybe you're in for 50 grand, something where it's like your liquidity could handle it. But for the vast majority of people, even a $1 million purchase price, my friend, you do not have $1 million liquid cash in the bank. So if you default on that, you are going bankrupt. So yes, a Q of E makes sense. That's point number one. But the second thing is right there, which is building a high quality deal team. I was, and I built community early. When I started looking into the ETA space, like 2020, 2021, I was very early on in the SMB Twitter groups. But the problem was that I was always a lurker. I was always like hanging out in the background. I was listening, I was reading. I remember when SMB law groups stood up. I was watching the background. I remember when the influencers first started coming in, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, and kind of would learn a little bit. And I would reach out to people to learn about things, specifically, but I was never engaged in the community. And as a result, I never really built a deal team around me. I trusted way too much on my own, skill set and knowledge. And I can't really tell you why. I guess part of it was arrogance, but the bigger part of it was just fear. I hadn't really become the person. I tell people now, like you have to become the person. I didn't have the I don't know, the self confidence to feel like I was going to be taken seriously, and so it kept me from engaging. I feel like that happens to a lot of people. They're like, you know, and I love the fact that the community has become so built out and so robust now, as opposed to where it was just 5 years ago. Um, but I'm not sure I would have been able to find like, engage that with somebody who was like really good QV or really good, SBA loan broker or X, Y, and Z. I talked to maybe three or four people who had actually bought a company before directly, and they were very helpful, but I should have done 10 times that. And so, one of the biggest lessons I've learned now is like, I need a really good team around me. I need somebody who's way better at that whole CFO part than I am. I need somebody who's way better at that operations part than I am. And that's why I said the one thing I did very well that I got absolutely right was the legal part. Thank God.
So maybe you could walk us through kind of how this story ended. And I'd love it if you could touch on some of the personal implications, because in following some of your content over the
Yeah.
years, I just have a list in front of me of stuff that really I found to be very, moving, very interesting, very raw, very honest. You said this cost me millions, my home, and nearly my marriage. You mentioned homelessness. You mentioned a profound sense of shame and failure. And honestly, I think a lot of people listening to this have experienced something similar. It's just that these are not the flags that we fly at the conferences when we talk about,
Yeah.
the 10x return in 4 years. So just walk us through how this story all ended. And if you wouldn't mind just kind of riffing on what it meant for you personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly why I talk about it, because you're right. There are a lot of people out there who experience the exact same thing that I talk about. But it's not fun to talk about it on LinkedIn. And so they're
Yeah.
not going to post about it. And not only that, 8 out of 10 of them legally can't. But the reality is still very true. And so as things started going in, going down the drain, I was so wrapped up in making this thing work. I knew the implications. I knew I had signed a personal guarantee on the seller's notes, and collectively that was about $1 million. That I knew that I owed, and so I was throwing everything I had into making this thing work. And as things started getting worse and worse and worse, right around February, March of, man, I hope I get my years right, 2024. Right around February, March of 24, I'm grasping for straws. I'm like doing everything I can. I'm like, moving money around just to make payroll, doing everything I can to keep things floating. And it becomes very clear. I'm like, look, this is not sustainable. Something has to change. And things were kind of ticking up in the right direction. Sales were getting a little better. But I was like, without an influx of cash, this is not going to work. And there's nowhere I can get any cash. It has to come from me. And so I threw a Hail Mary at the last minute of it. And what people don't know is that when I was in the Air Force, my wife and I, we spent 3 years in Germany. So we lived in Europe for a long time, really loved it. We still love traveling there. And it had always been a plan of ours to, get a second place in Europe, maybe even a second residency. And so we had actually applied for residency in Portugal like a while ago. And so, we found out that we had got approved. And so this crazy thought came ahead. I was like, all right, well, you know, in my day to day, I'm basically in the office, maybe 2 days a week, and I'm kind of helping the teams go. The teams all know each other. I've still got the foreman here. So what if I sold my home and I moved our family to Portugal and got a rental and cut my expenses in half, and then took the massive amount of equity I had in our home in California and just injected that in the business? We would probably be okay. And that sounds insane because it is, but that's what I remember my head was. I'm like, man, we got to keep this thing alive. And
Yeah.
so that's exactly what I did. We put the house on the market. We took a big withdrawal of it. I convinced my wife that it was the right move. And I was like, look, not only can we, and to be fair, I was not as open and honest with my wife as I should have been at all. I never let on that things were really that bad. But I was thinking, we can not only like, get this residency thing down, but we can also, inject a bunch of cash and it'll be great because I'm basically running the back end anyway. I can't build a retaining wall. They don't need me on site. And so there are
Yeah.
all these like issues, these like grasping for straws thoughts that I had of how I can keep this thing going. And like so many things, it worked out just enough to make me think it was going to work. Right. So we moved to Portugal. We got a rental. I got an influx of cash, put it in the business. That was gone in 4 weeks. Like it looked great in the beginning, and then it was just gone. Like I can't, it just sucked it all away. And And then as we kept closer and closer to June, things were kind of tipping up, and I was like, all right, we're about to have our biggest sales month ever in June. And I'm managing the whole thing from Portugal, kind of helping run the teams. We're doing like morning calls, and it's funny because you'll still, if you look hard enough, I did a call in April or May of that year with like a veterans group, and I'm calling from Portugal talking about how this is all happening. And right as we're coming up on June, which was going to be our biggest month so far, our number three customer just stops paying. And I
Mm.
found out later it's because they had a change of ownership themselves. There's a property management company, but it was big enough to where it completely destroyed our ability to make payroll. And we were, my foreman, general manager at the time, had made several trips over to their office. Hey, physically hand me the check. Nothing. And 6 weeks later, we could not make payroll. Everybody else was paying. That was so big for us. And that, I think the number three customer made up maybe, somewhere between around 10% of total profit, but the margin's so thin, that's all that mattered. And then by June 3rd, we couldn't make payroll and everybody walked off the job. And you have to imagine by then there had been all kinds of issues culturally, mechanically, things that had not been working out very well. So that was really the death nail. And by June 3rd, the whole thing was done. So the guys walk off the job. We lose all of our customers almost immediately. And now I'm sitting in Portugal and I've got no money. I actually took a screenshot on my phone at the time because I was like, someday, I forget, I was listening to a podcast from Alex Hormozy where he was talking about like when he was completely broke. And he was like, I wish I had taken a screenshot of like when I was completely broke. And I was like, this is bad. So I took a screenshot and it was like just my personal account was like negative several $1,000s. But that did not reflect like the personal guarantee or any of the other business accounts. Um, and at that point, we're like, all right, well, what do we do? And I was like, all right, well, this business is moving into bankruptcy. What do we do? And it came down to we had just a little bit of cash left. And so I came clean with the wife, told her exactly what happened. She was not happy, as you can imagine. And so we have two little boys, both under 4 at the time. So we grabbed our whole family, packed up what we had. And within 4 days, we flew back to the States because we figured, if we're going to go through this, we need to go through it in the States, obviously, if I'm going to rebuild from scratch. And then had nowhere to go because we sold our home. And so we moved in with my brother. And that was incredibly humbling to be completely broke without any kind of liquidity whatsoever, to the point to where like within a week, like my brother was buying food for us. We were living in his house. Like it was just, I cannot overemphasize the the how much my brother helped us out in that time. Like for the past year, how much he's helped us out, and no questions, and just we just moved right in, and and for the next 3 months, we went through the business bankruptcy, we went through settlement, we went through lawsuits back and forth, trying to figure out like who owes who what can we do with all this until finally getting to a settlement, and that's about we finally did get to a settlement about 4 months later, but that's about 3 or 4 months where I just basically like reclused into a cave. And
Yeah.
you know, I I'm fortunate enough to know to where like in that moment, like I didn't have like, thoughts of self-harm or anything like that. But now that with the amount of people I've talked to, that is the point where a lot of people have those types of thoughts. And that's why,
Yeah.
again, another reason why I talk about this. I was talking to somebody just last week who, nearly ended it when he was at that point in his journey. And it's really tough. You feel that incredible feeling of shame. I was used to making several $100,000s in tech. I was used to doing really, really cool things and never experiencing that level of failure. And then within the blink of an eye, you're completely broke, you're completely homeless. You can't take care of your wife and your kids, as a husband, as a father. Um, you've been public online about like you're doing this whole ETA thing and the whole thing crashes. Um, and then your relationship at the same time is taking a massive hit because man, I cannot get across enough. I was not as forthcoming as I should have been at all. Like I was just like,
Mm.
no, no, babe, it's fine. It's fine. We're gonna make it. It's fine. And then when it absolutely was not fine and everything like crashed and burned, I was like, here's all the mistakes I've made for the last 12 months. And
Yeah.
I am not exaggerating to say that, it is a miracle that we have stayed together these last 12 months. It has made us stronger, but big credit to my wife.
This episode is brought to you by Boulay. Now, for those of you who operate within the search fund ecosystem, you probably already know that Boulay is the standard when it comes to quality of earnings reports, tax, and audit services. But for those of you who are newer to the community, consider this. Over the past 20 years, Boulay has worked directly with hundreds of search funds from capital raise to exit, currently assisting over 150 funds in the search phase and another 125 in the operating phase. They work with searchers across the entirety of the ETA journey, from issuing K1s to your investors during the search phase, all the way through to helping prepare your books for an exit at the conclusion of the operating phase. They are the industry leader in performing financial due diligence and creating Q of E reports that your investors can rely on. They provide a full suite of tax services, both for your search fund and for the acquired company. They perform the annual audits required by most debt and equity investors. And they also perform outsourced accounting services, acting as a fractional bookkeeper and controller for those companies whose needs might not necessitate full time in house resources. In short, you can safely assume that these guys get it. They've grown up in the search fund ecosystem over the past 20 years, and they have the reputation to prove it. To learn more, go to boulaygroup.com. That's BOULAY group.com. Amazing. What an incredible story. There's this quote I came across a long time ago. I'll probably butcher it, but it says something to the effect of your superpower often sits right next to your greatest wound. And to me, it seems like you obviously had to deal with quite a wound, and clearly you've morphed it into your superpower. And, maybe, whether one believes in destiny or not, maybe this is just what you had to go through to now help people in the way that you are helping people, which is something that I just really deeply admire about you. Um, Given everything that you've just said, and of course, hindsight being 2020 being what it is, I have a couple
Yeah.
specific reflections I'd love to get from you. The first thing that you mentioned is you raised money from friends and family. I want to ask you about that
Yeah.
very idea because I'm sometimes asked about this, not terribly frequently, but frequently enough. And I often caution against it, but I don't have any firsthand experience. So I'm speaking almost hypothetically. I often say the kind of the classic line of like, hey, you don't want Thanksgiving dinner to be awkward when, your Uncle Jim asks you how the business is going. Any reflections, any lessons, any changes that you might make specific to the idea of raising from friends and family?
Yeah, I think you have to be very careful with it. Um, you know, a lot of us don't come from money. I certainly didn't. And so when I was thinking about like raising from friends and family, I raised from friends that I'd known since high school. I raised from military friends that I'd known for years, people I'd served with. And I raised from classmates at business school. And right around just a couple $100,000. And so when things go south, you have to make a few very uncomfortable phone calls. And to their credit, like everybody was very understanding about it. Like I was much more concerned about it, as you can imagine. I was like, hey, friend, none of you are rich, and I know I just blew 40 grand of your money, and I
Yeah.
don't have it. I don't know how I'm going to get it, but someday I'm going to get that back to you. And like I'm an adult. I understand that we all invest and things don't work out, and I'm under no obligation to pay that back. But personally, that was like they took a chance on me when no one else did, and
Yeah.
so I feel obligated to that. But I think it's a tricky road. A lot of people, especially when you're starting out, it's hard to find capital the first time. It's a little different now in self-funded search, and now that the ecosystem is so robust. Now, if you find a good deal and you're a qualified buyer, it's a good business buyer fit, there are plenty of investors out there who help you bridge the gap. And I absolutely
Yeah.
recommend you go that route. Not
Yeah.
just because it helps make Thanksgiving not so awkward if things go down, but because hopefully, if you find investors who have done a few deals before, their willingness or lack of willingness to invest in your deal should end up being an indicator as to the health of your
Yeah.
deal. So that can be a little bit, of a check. But look, it's important. I've got one of my best friends from high school. Like, he gave me $73,000, and he is not a rich guy, and that's a difficult conversation. It's a really difficult conversation, and yeah, it's absolutely a strain. And so I do caution people when it comes to raising for friends and family. I'm not going to say don't do it. Sometimes, it can be the thing that can help you get it across the finish line. And sometimes if you're able to raise money from people who know you best, that can help you get started. But, make no misunderstanding here. When things go south, it can really suck.
Yeah. Second thing I want to ask is about the company and the transaction. So company size specifically, you mentioned that it was about $2 million in
Yeah.
revenue. And I can't remember if that was deal number one or deal number two, but regardless, $2 million
Yeah.
in revenue is small, even for our ecosystem. So I'd love to get general reflections, lessons just from that, as well as the
Yeah.
price. Noticed on your website, I think you said you bought at what felt like an incredibly low price, about two times SDE. So if you could just kind of
Yeah.
riff on the size question and the incredibly low price question and how you reflect on both of those.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest questions I get from searchers now, which is, does size matter? And absolutely it does. I tell everybody, go as big as you possibly can. And even if you're just staying within the SBA space, because it absolutely mitigates your risk. And I break it down this way. I'm like, look, let's assume you're going to take out an SBA loan and you're going to buy, one company that's going to cost a purchase price of 1 million, and you got another one that's going to be 5 million. So let's talk about the risk to you as a searcher. If you buy business number one at $1 million purchase price and it goes under, you're bankrupt. If you buy business number two and it goes under, you're bankrupt. So there's no risk differential for you. But the underlying fundamentals and health of a $5 million business are going to be better than the one, just mathematically speaking. You're going to have a much more robust employee structure. You're going to have much more robust cash flows. You're going to have better customers. All kinds of things are better at the larger side. And you can still acquire at that side. Now, of course, you still have to go find it. That's the problem. It's easy to find the tiny ones, but the big ones are a little bit harder to find. And yes, they could be a little bit more competitive. But if you're talking about mitigating your risk structure, absolutely go bigger than you think you can. And I think a couple of reasons why I went smaller when I did, first and foremost, because I had not become the person. Like to me, the idea of buying $1 million company sounded big. It sounded huge. I was like, oh, it's pretty
Yeah.
big,
Yeah.
and it's one of the things I talk to searchers about all the time now. It's like, yeah, you think it's big because if you're going to buy a house, you think your mind goes to 300, 400, 600,000, maybe 800 or a million if you're in California. And to most of us, to 99% of people, that is the largest transaction you're ever going to have. But a business at $1 million is the smallest it's ever going to be. And so mentally getting your head over that threshold, now you realize that even at the top end of the SBA level is still incredibly tiny.
Yeah.
In my mind, there's no such thing as buying an SBA sized business that's not owner operated, that you're not rolling up your sleeves, getting in the work. And so I really caution people to think about, business is fundamentally different. You do need to go bigger. Bigger is healthier. Multiples expand for a reason. And that's because of the robustness and the risk mitigation in that business. And so
Yeah.
that's what I really push people on. And I tell you, like, I looked at it, I thought, wow, look at the upside potential. Sure, it's there, but man, the risks are so bad. Like customer
Yeah.
number three, one customer stopped paying, put us under, and
Yeah.
that's just to talk about all the other issues we had with the business. And so there are so many reasons why when I talk to searchers and they say, I'm going to start with something small. I've never owned a company. I should probably start with something
Yeah.
small. Like I understand why logically that makes sense to you, but I'm telling you that is not the world that we live in.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Like my experience with first-time buyers who initially start out targeting smaller business, they never use these words, but behind the words that they choose to use, I often hear a sentiment like the following. Hey, this seems really hard. This seems really overwhelming. I've never done this before. How could I possibly make this easier for myself? Oh, I know. I'll buy a smaller
Yeah.
business. I'll wrap my arms around it and then I'll scale up from there. As you said, that's a tempting train of seemingly logical thought. But what I've learned over the years, obviously, as you've learned,
Yeah.
is smaller does not necessarily equal easier. In fact, in
Yeah.
many instances, it means just the opposite.
Absolutely. Exactly the opposite. And all you need to do is look at the multiples for a reason, right? There's a reason why larger companies trade at much larger multiples. It's because it doesn't matter who the CEO is. The thing's going to continue moving just fine. And what I find is that if you can wrap your head around the fact that the risk goes down as the company size goes up, generally speaking, like I'm not a blanket rule, but the very next question, the underlining unsaid thing is, who am I to raise $10 million?
Yeah.
How could I ever do that? I have searchers today talk to me about how they don't think that they can raise capital from investors to do SBA level deals. I'm like, they're everywhere. They're everywhere, like everywhere. Have you been to an ETA conference? They're swarming, right? Have you taken the time to get out and meet people? They're everywhere. And
Yeah.
so, I attended McGuire Woods for the first time just 2 months ago, and I was overwhelmed. It was like I knew this was the case, but it was different to see it personally and be like, there are hundreds of millions of dollars just sitting on the sideline waiting to be deployed if you will A, be the person, build the team, and then B, find a deal worth investing in. There's plenty of
Yeah.
capital out there. It's just, again, back to like that mental stronghold we have about business size. There's another mental stronghold it is with it, if, most people have never had a six-figure job, but even if you have, the idea that someone's going to swoop in and be like, oh yeah, I'll give you $10 million to help, buy this company or, whatever the case may be, it feels overwhelming. You have this overwhelming sense of like, who am I? Like,
Yeah.
why would they invest? Even if they did invest, how could I even do this? You feel so outside of your depth.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I understand the feeling, but again, these are feelings.
How about the valuation question? So you mentioned, or at least I think online your website mentioned that one of the two companies was acquired at an incredibly low multiple. I think as low as like two or three times STE.
Yeah, 2x.
How do you reflect on that? What lessons did you learn? I mean, many acquirers listening to this are salivating at the prospect of buying something for
Yeah.
two times. So if you could just riff on that and take that in any direction that you'd like to.
Yeah, what was it? Warren Buffett said, "I'd rather buy a great business at a good price than a good business at a great price."
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many searchers I've spoken to who say, "Man, I found this company and they're really great. They've got a great track record. They've got all this X, Y, and Z, but they're kind of on the decline. Like last year, they lost, the revenues went down a little bit and they've kind of ticking down. So this is a great turnaround story. I can get it at a great price." And I just remind people over and over and over in business acquisition, price matters. Absolutely. You don't want to overpay, but
Yeah.
getting a deal means you're buying distressed. And a first time buyer has absolutely no business buying distressed whatsoever. And
Yeah.
so I would love to buy a very good, very robust, very excellent business at five times, at six times even. But the idea of buying a distressed business at three times or even two and a half, like the odds, like you've never run a company. So let's start there. You have a lot to learn. And now you're saying, I'm going to take all of that and I'm going to buy something that is fundamentally failing. So I've never run it, but I'm sure I'm so confident that not only can I run this company, but I can run one that's failing and turn it around. My brother in Christ, you're on the wrong path. Like I just tell people, look, take a big pause, a
Yeah.
huge pause. Um, I would, and to that point though, I would absolutely, not only look for a better company, but I would bring in way more capital, even if I don't need it. If I'm buying an SBA level business, let's just assume I'm buying a $5 million company. I would bring in as much outside capital as possible. I would give away the farm as much as possible to bring in extra cash and drive my DSCR up to, above 1.5, maybe even as high as two, because
Yeah.
you're still going to own 65% of that thing, not 85. That's fine. I'd rather own 65% of a very healthy, very good business 4 years from now than 85, 95% of an over-levered company that goes to bankruptcy 12 to 18 months from now. And so people
Yeah.
fundamentally misunderstand the ownership structures and why that matters. Because we all, especially when you're starting out, we all have these grand visions of holdcos and roll-ups and, all this stuff. Even if we only want to buy that one business and steward its legacy forever, like you've never done it. So buy a
Yeah.
company, go as safe as you possibly can, bring in as much equity as possible, drive that debt down as much as you possibly can. And then if you decide, hey, I want to own this company forever, if that's really your plan, buy out your investors in years 4 and 5. That's fine. You can do that. And
Yeah.
you haven't really you've mitigated your risk immensely, and you've had very little impact on your returns. So soapbox, I'll step off of it. Sorry.
I am curious your view today on investment theses that are very much dependent on M&A. And to be clear,
Yeah.
just because a consolidation strategy worked out doesn't mean that it's always a good idea. Just because it didn't work
No.
out doesn't necessarily mean that it's always a bad idea. I'm just curious how your thoughts have changed on an investment thesis that kind of smells like that, if they've changed at all.
No, they've absolutely changed. And I think they're starting to change in the market overall. And this kind of speaks to what we're doing now at Sunset Coast. We're an independent sponsor firm and we really focus on government contracting. And government contracting is ripe for M&A. It kind of always is, kind of based on how government contracting works. But the way I see it now is like you have to drive organic growth first. That has to be step number one. In a world of like, free money and zero rates, then, following M&A makes so much sense because you're basically getting paid to be accretive.
Yeah.
But in a world where you have to drive actual value, you know, you need to find a really good platform acquisition that actually has the potential to drive organic growth. It's already doing it. Because if you don't have that, then you're not going to have the cash flow to actually do that accretive M&A. So even in the
Yeah.
deal we have right now, like when we put our sim together and we started pitching to investors, we included no inorganic M&A in an industry where we absolutely expect to have M&A. We did not even factor it into our financial model whatsoever. We want to be like, hey, if we bought this company and organic growth was cut in half and we lost percent of our revenue due to small business set aside issues and we did no M&A whatsoever, what would this look like on the pro forma 5 years from now? And is that the baseline that we're comfortable with? And if the answer is yes, then my friend, steam forward, but that should be your base. It shouldn't be like, oh, I'm going
Yeah.
to do this big roll up. Oh, I'm going to do all this other stuff. Because when you do that, you're setting yourself up for failure in so many ways. Not just the integration issues, but the massive amount of capital that is required to do work. And then you're also making a huge bet on the market that you're going into. You're assuming that you're right about the market, which you could be absolutely wrong about. And then if you're right, you're assuming that you're going to be the team that gets it done, which someone else could get that done. So there,
Yeah.
I'd rather keep, as many assumptions in-house as possible. And then as those opportunities come up, yeah, of course, take advantage of them. But that shouldn't be
Yeah.
your fundamental, like your initial, decision, unless you have experience doing roll-ups, unless you've got experience doing this in other sectors or even the same sector, and you've got the capital to back it up.
So closely related to that would be the speed with which you acquired your first bolt-on. You mentioned that you acquired your second
Yeah.
company 35 days after you acquired your first. I think I know your answer to this one, but at the risking of asking it anyway, how do you reflect on speed? And to kind of paraphrase what you said, hey, I see a really meaningful opportunity. Now that I'm a business owner, people are actually taking my phone calls. I see what the future could look like. I now have more
Yeah.
credibility as a buyer. Why would I not do this? Your reflections on just like the speed with which one ought to consider their first bolt-on after they, first find themselves parachuted into the CEO seat.
Yeah. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but if I had just paused and waited 12 months, we probably would not be having this conversation. Things could have worked out. And I say that because when you're in the moment, it feels like you have this opportunity is presented to you and you have to move now if you're going to take advantage of it, right?
Yeah.
And so it always feels like speed is of the essence. We always hear, time kills all deals. But that's also works in reverse. Like you move too fast, that time will kill your deal too. And so if I had taken a big break, like after acquiring business number one, when all the interest, I'd already had the pipeline going, but when all that additional interest had picked up, if I had instead of moving forward with follow-on and bolt-on acquisitions, if I had just taken a big pause and said, hey, let's get really comfortable with business number one, not just from a fundamentals perspective, but I'm new to the industry. How about I take some time to, get involved in this company, maybe go build a retaining wall, maybe understand it a little bit better. And then while doing all that, I'm going to build relationships with each one of these owners and that have already expressed that interest because that'll give me time to not only build relationships, but also to understand their businesses, understand are these really good opportunities to actually do bolt-ons, or does it kind of look good, but in reality it wouldn't work out? Like I did not take that time. And then
Yeah.
I also, realized that like if I had taken the time, like and built those relationships, those deals weren't going to go away. I own the relationship. Like they're not going to go and sell to somebody else unless Brightview swoops in and offers them, 8x on their company, which they're never going to get. They weren't going to get some other exit. I was the only game in town. So, literally and figuratively. So
Yeah.
if I had just taken a big pause, then, it's possible today I could be sitting here with this, 15 million top line landscaping company in San Diego. But
Yeah.
like we also said, you know, you you never really know where these things are going to turn out. And as incredibly painful as the last 24 months has been for my family and I really think that all of this happened for a reason. Like I got
Yeah.
an incredible crash course in how things can get done, how things can go incredibly badly, what it feels like to be sitting in the seat, you scrambling to keep things moving. And also experiencing bankruptcy and settlements and litigation. I'm not scared of lawsuits anymore. Like, and then having that kind of wisdom experience, it has absolutely shaped everything I'm doing now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very clear. And I mean that in the most complimentary way possible. You know, a lot of it's become almost like cliche to say that acquisitions are the easy part. It's actually integration that's the hard part. And I think a lot of people like agree with
Yeah.
that at like an intellectual level. But can you get tactical with us and tell us like what is it
Yeah.
about integrations that make them so gosh darn difficult?
People. It's the people. It's always the people. And I mean, you could spend time, listening to podcasts, and if you spend enough time, you'll realize over and over and over that, when we talk about strategy and integrations and business development, we very rarely talk about, oh, we built up this new business line and it's servicing this customer and we saw organic growth of X, Y, Z. What we're really talking about is, oh, I brought in a new person to run this particular thing, or
Yeah.
I had some kind of conflict between these people, or it's always people based, or hiring. I need to find really good people. I'm having a lot of trouble getting good salesmen, getting good managers. Um, so it all comes down to people. And you know, I I talk to a lot of people who are like, searchers who have this misunderstanding that real estate is somehow similar to business acquisition. Like they're going to have this portfolio of real estate and also a portfolio of small businesses. And I remind them that the thing with real estate is like when it goes to zero, at least there's something there. There's usually a house, there's some land, there's something there. In business, when it goes to zero, there's nothing there. And it doesn't matter how heavy capex you are. You could be an aircraft manufacturer with big equipment. All that stuff goes to salvage value. It's gone. If business the value is it is a collection of people who do something together that is exponentially more valuable than any one of them could do on their own. So it all comes down to people and teams. And so when you're looking at, merging businesses or doing tuck-ins, then you always have to think about, one, does this make sense financially? Does it make sense on the P&L? Does it make sense for the business and the strategy going forward? Obviously, otherwise we can't have this conversation. But then the next
Yeah.
very close thing we need to talk about is how are these people going to integrate together? And I always start now by looking at the owner, because the owner the business is a direct reflection of them. They've spent the last couple of decades, most likely, building this team. So it's going to reflect their values, the things that they think are important, the culture that they've built. And yes, you can turn that ship, but it's going to take some time. So if you buy a
Yeah.
company and it's going to take you 12 to 36 months to really put your fingerprint on the culture of that company, unless you plan on firing all the people within the first couple of weeks. So, you know, it is the people every single time. It's always the people. And so it's really hard to really express how important that is until you've been the person in the seat. But
Yeah.
until you have employees who just don't show up for work, or you have employees who, they don't care about the business like you do, or you have general managers who, make decisions that you wouldn't have made, or you have employees who don't want to work together because they don't like each other, like all kinds of issues that don't jump out on the spreadsheet.
Yep. Yep.
And
That
quite
makes
frankly,
sense.
they're hard to diligence for. Like I don't get to interview
Very hard.
interview all the employees before. So yeah, it's tough.
Um, Let me ask you about the personal guarantee. And again, similar sentiment to what we just talked about a few minutes ago. Just because a personal guarantee got tripped doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad idea. Just because it didn't get tripped doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. I would imagine that this is very
Yeah.
circumstantial. How do you, I mean, you get searchers calling you all day long, presumably asking about the merits and the risks of taking the personal guarantee. Now that you've been through
Yeah.
it, how do you think about that?
I think you have to fundamentally understand the risk that you're getting into. I don't have a problem with personal guarantee. I don't. Even as someone who's experienced the bad end of one. Because if I'm looking at something like, obviously I personally guaranteed the seller's notes, but let's look at the SBA program. Like there is no program in the world that allows somebody with almost no money to their name and a halfway
Yeah.
decent credit score to borrow $5 million of capital. It
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
doesn't exist. Self-funded search as a concept does not exist outside of being a US citizen, right? So I talked to searchers in Europe and Australia and South Africa. They're all independent sponsors. There's no such thing as self-funded search. And so um, if you're talking to me as a brand new searcher and you've never owned a business and you want to acquire, but you're like, I'm never going to use a personal guarantee, well then fine, go raise capital, go get some cash, but don't come to me and expect that you're going to own 85% of this thing. So
Right.
it is a cost of doing business, especially if you're a first time buyer. I don't have a problem with that because why else would I give you $5 million? Like why? Like what? Even when you trip the personal guarantee, you can't pay me back. Like you don't have the collateral. So I'm already at a loss. So I understand why it exists. I caution searchers to understand, like, don't try to get around the personal guarantee. What you should do though is find a business worth signing a personal guarantee for. That's what you should do.
Mm.
And so, and you need to fundamentally understand the risk and downside of the personal guarantee. And so, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for the business? What does that mean, for your diligence? If the personal guarantee should scare you enough to do good diligence, it should scare you enough to not treat this like a side hustle. It should scare you enough to
Yeah.
say, okay, well, I've never built a financial model and it's kind of scary, but man, I really need to know how it's done. I don't need to be the best in the world, but I better be able to build one. Good. Because if you buy a company and you can't do that, the personal guarantee should scare you away from that. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there encouraging people to take personal guarantees who have no understanding of the risk involved. And so
Yeah.
business acquisition, just like everything else, requires risk. There's no such thing as a deal that doesn't have risk. And you have to eventually get to the point to where you're comfortable, taking that risk and understanding the hair in the deal and saying, all right, well, this is the unknown unknowns that I don't know, and that's where I'm willing to take that chance. But you shouldn't be taking a chance because you don't know how to build a financial model, or you didn't bring in and get a Q of E done. You don't have a really good lawyer or legal team because you decided to let ChatGPT build your LOI for you. Like, there are a lot of things here where, you should be able to do proper deal and proper risk mitigation that allows you to get to the point where you're like, all right, well, am I comfortable signing the personal guarantee for this business? Have I done the work ahead of time to say that this is a good idea? Understanding that even while doing all the work, I could be wrong and I could go bankrupt. That's the
Yeah.
real decision maker.
Yeah. Super interesting way to frame it. How about this idea of the business is a direct reflection of the owner? Um,
Yeah.
my question is, so first of all, I would generally agree with that. You mentioned a Buffett quote earlier. He also said something to the effect of like, you can never do a good deal with a bad person. So seems like he agrees with you.
Yeah, 100%.
Um, my question is like, how do you diligence that? Because,
Yeah.
first of all, in a transaction process, everybody is on their best behavior. And also, frankly, when I was searching and I was creating a relationship with my seller, I generally felt as if I had a decent sense as to whether he was an honest, trustworthy person. Turns out he was. So thankfully, I didn't have any issues in that regard. But now, as an investor, if I'm lucky, I will be on a 12 on 1 hour Zoom call where myself and 14 other investor colleagues get to interview him or her for 60 minutes. And quite frankly, it's really hard to know if we're dealing with an
It's
honest,
impossible.
ethical person. So now that you've
Yeah.
kind of been through it all, and now that you're advising and investing, how do you diligence that? If you can diligence it at all?
Yeah. Well, the good news, at least from the investor standpoint, is it's very easy. You're diligencing the searcher. You're diligencing the sponsor. You're putting all your faith in that person, and you have to ask them the questions. So that's how you do it. As an investor, there's no way you could do it. It's not possible. You simply don't have the touch points. So you're really betting on the jockey, not the horse. You really need to put yourself behind someone that you trust. That is, and you ask them the pointed questions, and then you trust the answers that they give to you.
Yeah.
So that as a searcher, though, you're right. It is a feeling. When I was at NYU, they talked about EQ over IQ, and I don't really agree with that, but I understand where they're coming from. There's so many things that happen from an EQ perspective, from an emotional quotient, with that you can't really explain. You know what it's like when you meet someone, they just feel slimy, or
Yeah.
there's just something about them that feels abrasive. And it's very easy for us to disregard those feelings because we think, oh, well, everyone says that this particular seller is kind of abrasive. That doesn't mean the business is bad. Or everyone says this particular seller does X, Y, and Z. Or I really think that the way people do something is the way they do everything. And so
Yeah.
the way I would diligence going forward, and I have plenty of stories to talk about this, but the way I would look at diligence is, first and foremost, if you're not doing background checks are basic. Like, you need to do a background check, right? You need to know if this person has a history of defaulting on their payments, if they have a
Yeah.
history of not paying their suppliers, if they have a history of being in litigation and lawsuits. And not just all that stuff is necessarily bad, but you want to know what that looks like. Is this somebody who pays their bills on time, or is this somebody who's leaving suppliers hanging all around town?
Yeah.
But the other thing I realized, which is something I actually recommend to searchers all the time now, is if you're looking for a business, especially in a local geography, again, everyone knows each other. And so, you know, landscaping, for instance, if all the companies in a particular area are in landscaping, then there's probably getting their supplies from about two or three different places. The site ones, like the local supply shops, right? As a result, all the employees know each other, most of the owners know each other, and definitely the managers at those supply companies have seen everybody. And so I just show up and without giving myself away, I start asking questions like, "Hey, do you know this company? What's their reputation? Would you go with them?" And you'd be surprised how much gossip you can get really fast. Does someone have a
Yeah.
good reputation in town? Is someone who, treats employees well, somebody who pays their bills on time, somebody who, you're going to hear so much tea. Oh, they had a divorce back in 93, and then, they stopped paying their employees and they canceled that business and started a new one. And all the stuff that won't show up in diligence. And so
Yeah.
I highly encourage you to get involved like in the ecosystem and find out, who externally has those touch points, and without, breaking confidentiality, get out there and start finding out what that tea is, because it is
Yeah.
it is out there. Absolutely. But, you know, one of my business coaches, Myron Golden, he talks about how the small business. The reason I say it's a direct reflection of its owners, because he always talks about how small business is like it's the modern day kingdom, and I completely agree, especially in the United States. If you own 51% of a small business, you're king. You're king. You're God. You're emperor. You can do almost anything you want, and as a result, that power goes to your head, and you mold your business to reflect you. If you're going to run your personal finances to the business, you're going to do it. No one's going to stop you. If
Yeah.
you're gonna hire some people, fire some people. Like if you're someone who screams a lot in the office, if you're somebody who is like, always taking the time to do like, pizza Fridays, like what you want to do is going to come out. And so that's why, I mean, it's a direct reflection of you. And so the culture of that business is going to reflect the owner completely, not just who they hired, but who they didn't hire, not just the systems that they put in place, but the things they didn't put in place. And so there's always going to be gaps in small business. But are those gaps because the owner has a integrity issue, or are those gaps because the owner is really good at being a people person and really good at being a salesperson, but just is not a technical person? As a result, they don't have a good accounting system. Is it a gap that makes sense because of who the owner is, or is it a gap because they're just fundamentally not a great person that you want to get involved with? And there's about 29 million small businesses in America. I firmly believe that more than half of them are run by halfway decent, upstanding individuals. Go buy a company from one of them. Because if you buy a company from somebody who has proven to you, even in a small way, that they don't have integrity, that they cannot be trusted, then that is exactly the kind of person who's going to come back and compete with you against the non-compete. It's somebody who's going to try to steal your customers. It's somebody who is going to leave outstanding bills for you lying around town. It's somebody who's going
Yeah.
to meddle in the business post close. And I can tell you now, after interviewing over 40 people who have bought a business and then experienced business failure in the last 5 years, with over 60% of those situations, it's because the seller actively destroyed that company post close. It's because there was some
Wow.
sort of integrity issue. And honestly, it surprised me. I thought it was going to be cash flow, but cash flow is number two.
Yeah. Wow. Super, super valuable insight. What about this idea of searching on the side? Has your opinion
Yeah.
changed on that based on your experience?
No, I absolutely believe you should search on the side. If you're a self-funded searcher, you're searching on the side. And the biggest reason is because of this you get search stress. You get the point to where you don't realize how intense it's going to be and how much it's going to take out of you. And so here's what I mean. When you first start searching, uh, you're so excited. You're ready to go. You've got some capital. You think you're going to buy the best business in the world. You're going to find that diamond in the rough. You're going to be the guy or gal. And at 3 months, you're feeling motivated. At 6 months, you're excited because things are starting to finally click into place, because it takes time to figure out how these things work. And maybe you're getting your funnel built out. By 9 months, you've got some decent deal flow. Maybe you've got your first LOI. That's great. And you're starting to go through the process, and you're starting to learn. You're like, oh man, I'm actually searching now. But then around month like 13, 14, you've had a couple, maybe one or two busted LOIs, and you're like, man, I got to go find another one. Man, my
Right.
funnel kind of slowed down while I was in that last diligence process. Maybe I've got some dead deal costs from that last one. Now I've got less capital than I thought I did. And so
Yeah.
what does happen is, by the time you get to, and I've seen it over and over and over, by the time you get to month 17, 18, 23, it really starts to weigh on you. You look back and you're like, hey, what about that one that got away? Maybe that one at like month 9 was the one I was supposed to
Yes.
buy, and I really,
Always.
blew it. Maybe like you're like, I've already wasted $20,000 in dead deal costs. I can't do that again, you know? Um, and not to mention the emotional aspect. I've been posting on LinkedIn for months that I'm a self-funded searcher. I've been going out doing the work. Everyone expects me to buy, and I still have not bought a company.
Yeah.
The stress really does weigh on you. I think of one particular searcher I spoke with, and he was in month, I want to say 19 or 20, and he was feeling it. He was feeling the stress, and he found this company. He's like, I remember thinking, I found this company, and it was fine. I wasn't super excited about it, but it was fine enough to where I was like, yeah, sure, let's meet the seller, let's start checking off the boxes. And it checked off enough boxes. I put in an LOI that I thought was reasonable. Nothing too crazy, but the seller accepted. So I was like, oh, cool. All right. Well, it's just kind of happened. Now we're in exclusivity. And so I went into diligence, brought in my QOV, and he said something that was striking. He was like, you know, the QOV was getting done. And I remember thinking while waiting for it to come back, I hope the QOV disqualifies this business. He had
Oh,
that thought.
interesting.
And I was like, why? And he's like, I don't know. He's like, it just didn't feel right. And I remember thinking, it was checking the boxes, but I didn't love it. And then sure enough, the QOV came back and you're good. QOV was green, like it was off by a little, but nothing crazy. And then he looked at it and he was like, all right, QOV says it's fine. Everybody else says it's fine. And he was like, I've been here long enough, and then the rationalizations come in where no deal's perfect. There's always hair on the
Yes.
deal. You know, maybe this is the feeling I'm supposed to have because I never bought a company. I don't want to not buy because I'm scared to buy. Is it because I'm scared? All the numbers say it's right. And so, he shut down those internal warning signs and went ahead and bought the company. Sure enough, there was fraud. There's actual fraud in the company. And, you know, that's why I really do think that searching on the side makes a lot of sense because you should not treat this as a startup with startup capital. If you're a traditional searcher and you're getting paid to search, that's one thing. Congratulations, go search full time. But 99% of people are self-funded searchers. And at that point, your job is the thing that is funding your search. Don't ever put yourself, your family in financial strain because you want to be able to do this quote full time. And beyond that, I also fundamentally reject the idea that you can't search full time because I've worked multiple jobs. I've worked, at big tech. I've searched on the side, and I was still able to put in 4 or 5 hours of actual search every single day. And granted, I only had one kid at the time, but I look at every phase of my life. I look back and I think, when I was in college, I thought I was busy. And then when I joined the Air Force, I thought I was busy. And then I got deployed, I thought I was busy. And then I got married and I thought I was busy. And now I've got two kids. And I look back and I'm like, every time I thought I was busy, I would kill to have that kind of time back. And
Yeah.
I'm telling you, you have way more time than you think you do. And your schedule follows your priorities. And so you can make the time. And if you think that the moment you buy a company, all of a sudden you're going to have all this free time, you're incredibly wrong. You're working 90 hours a week if you're lucky. Like, you know, if you're going to start doing the work now, do the work now. Like, make
Yeah.
sure you're putting in the effort and don't financially strain yourself by quitting your job and giving yourself this arbitrary deadline because that's how you start feeling that sunk cost. You know, man, I can't break this LOI because I've already put in 15 grand for the QOV. And if I
Yeah.
break this LOI, I don't have another 15 grand for QOV. Red flag.
Yeah.
The failure is not buying a company. Failure is buying one that puts you into bankruptcy. That's the failure.
Yeah. Jed, tell us about what you're doing today, because I'm sure many folks listening to this who have heard your story and heard the wisdom that you've gained over having overcome these challenges would be super interested to hear what you're doing. So I'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah, part of it's intentional, part of it is completely by accident. But you know, about 3, 4 months after my settlement, I started emerging from the cave of despair, and I got back online. And this was around fall of fall of 24, probably like August, September of 24. I could go back and look at LinkedIn to find out for sure. But I started getting back on, and I saw all the things I had missed while I was gone. I saw the influencers, I saw the propaganda, I saw all that stuff, and I cannot express to you how much it just drove me mad. Finding people who are like, no, you can buy a portfolio of 10 small businesses, all with personal guarantees, with like almost with other people's money, and it's all passive. Don't worry about it. And it drove me crazy. And part of it was because I was incensed. And I started commenting. Yeah, I would see these posts about like, oh, this is what I did. I bought like they list out their portfolio, the numbers, and I would just do the math. I'm like, well, based on your industry, this is what your net income looks like, and that is wrong. And not to I wasn't trying to be, abrasive. I mean, I was probably trying to be a little abrasive, but I was really just frustrated because of all of this, all this talk. Everybody out there is trying to tell you to go buy a business because it's so easy and it's so passive and it costs you no money and it's super low risk. And why would anyone start a startup? Because you could just, use the SBA and personal guarantees don't matter. And the SBA default rate is something like 4%. So of course you're going to win, right? And it's maddening. And then one by one, I started getting people DMing me on LinkedIn. They're like, "Hey, I spent $10,000 with this guru," and or "Oh, I just lost my job and I've got like 15 grand left. I was thinking about spending it with this other person," and that drove it even further because I was like, it felt like a righteous fight. But what the pivot really came when someone DM'd me about a month after I started, kind of responding, and it was like, "Hey, my business failed last year," and that's what happened. And so we got on a call, and I was like, "Hey, let's talk," and it became very emotional. And then I realized that I wasn't alone because you don't realize it, but there's other people who've been through this too, and they're
Yep.
not talking about it.
Yep.
And it never really crossed my mind that other people experience this. I knew it was like technically possible, but I didn't really conceptualize it. And then sure enough, more people started reaching out, more people started reaching out. And I started finding out that like, everyone from Harvard business grads all the way down to like, blue collar workers who had sell or finance their company from their owner, like it happened to everybody. It didn't matter if you know, if you like my partner, Joe Odell, like he raised a traditional fund. That business failed. It didn't matter if you were a self-funded searcher, that business failed. Like it didn't matter if you did 100% seller financing, that business failed. Like there are all kinds of issues of why companies fail. And it's funny, I started having all these conversations, and these people, they like me, they couldn't talk about them. They wanted someone else to talk to. They wanted someone else to like express that to. And I was like, yeah, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about what went right, what went wrong. I'm never going to disclose your name. I'm never going to disclose, what your company. But part of it was just an outlet. And then that led to, me wanting to tell my story, me wanting to put that stuff out there. But I couldn't like disclose everything. I couldn't say, just like on this podcast, I couldn't say the details of what happened. And that was the
Yep.
same issue that they had. And so had the idea. I was like, well, how about I compile all these stories into one book, and like we'll change the names, we'll change the industries, but the core concepts will be the same. And let's get those lessons across. And that's what it came into. The thing that I really did not expect though was, I had a conversation last week, and I actually just posted on YouTube like 2 days ago. But I had a conversation last week with a gentleman named Renan Cortez. He's a veteran, bought a company, 100% seller financing, zero out of pocket, like the dream deal, right? And everything was going great for 2 or 3 years, and then on the third year, it just spun out of control, and the whole thing crashed. And we had a very human conversation, very much like a lot of the conversations I've had with people who have reached out and said, "Hey, I'm filing for bankruptcy today. Hey, I think I'm going to file for bankruptcy in 30 days. What do you recommend?" And it all comes down to the same thing. It's like because we don't talk about it, when that if that moment ever happens to you, it feels like you're staring down this long dark tunnel and you don't know how you're going to escape. And for most people, they don't know what bankruptcy looks like. They don't know the impact on them, the shame involved, the feeling of failure, the feeling of, just abstract ruin. And I used to say that, when my business failed, we lost everything. And now I don't say that anymore. I say we lost all our money. Because the great thing about America is we can always go make more money, but you can't get your family back. You can't get your kids back. You can't fix divorce. And if you take it to the final step, you can't undo bad decisions. And like I was talking with Renan last week, or Renan, and he talked about how like things were going so well, but when they went down, there was a point where he was sitting in his office with his handgun on the desk, like committed, ready to go. And if it hadn't been for an old battle buddy of his who just called him out of the blue, was like, "Hey man, what's going on?" And then he told him, "It's like, honestly, this is what's happening, and I'm about to do this." And his friend like walked him back from the cliff, thank God. But of the 40 plus people I've talked to at this point, over five of them have verbally expressed thoughts of suicide. And if I know that those people have verbally said it, I know there's twice as many who didn't say that, but still felt
Yeah.
it. And so, I told my wife just a couple of days ago, I was like, I never thought I'd be the business therapist. um, but it's important. It's really important, one, for the people who have experienced it directly, and two, for everybody else who needs to learn these lessons because, you know, so many of them are so obvious. And if we can just help you avoid a few of those, then and not experience that same outcome, then that'd be great. Because we all know that risk is always going to be there. And so this could happen to you in any deal. And so it's important to understand, like as you're going into it, if you're going to take the risk, then what does that worst case look like? Because it's not as scary as it looks. But if you don't think about it, if you don't measure that risk, then if it does happen to you, then it feels like the abyss. It feels like you can't get through it. And so
Yeah.
just shining a light on it really does eliminate over half of the problem.
Yeah. What is the book called and when is it coming out?
It's called Buyer Beware: Lessons of Failed Business Buyers. It was supposed to come out in October, but then we went under LOI for the platform in August, and that completely delayed everything. And so right now, I'm scrambling to get the last of it together. I'm hoping to release as soon as possible. I'm thinking probably February, March at the latest. But once I get that together, I'll make sure to post about it.
Awesome. Jed, I got to be honest. I mean, like I said, I'm familiar with your story from the outside looking in. I was directionally familiar, given everything that you've shared so candidly. And I didn't really know what to expect coming into our conversation today. But, like I said, I really believe in this idea that like your superpower very often sits right next to your greatest wound. And I don't know if I'm necessarily someone that agrees that like everything happens for a reason. I don't know. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I honestly don't know. But I do believe in the fact that like we're all kind of meant to do something. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's a very nonlinear, circuitous path for us to land on like the thing that we were meant to do. For whatever it's worth, it seems to me like you are doing the thing that you were put on this earth to do. And I think you had to go through all of that shit to help you do what you're doing now and to help other people. So I'll just conclude by just saying I have an enormous amount of respect and gratitude and appreciation for you. I think our community needs more people like you, and I think more entrepreneurs need to hear stories like yours. But to your point, not everyone is comfortable sharing. But not only are you comfortable sharing, you're comfortable helping people avoid some of the mistakes that you made. And I just think that that is something that is enormously valuable to our community, and you're making the world a better place in your own small way, which is not something that everyone can say. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for everything that you're doing for our community. I really admire you and really admire what you're doing.
Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it, and I agree. This is not the path I would have chose. But looking back in hindsight, I'm very glad that it happened. It was incredibly painful, but you gain a lot of wisdom through stuff like that. And now, I'm able to like talk to searchers and say, hey, this is probably a big red flag you should watch out for. And I can tell people, with complete honesty, like, look, nobody cares about you not experiencing bankruptcy more than I do, because I know what that feels like.
Yeah.
Um, if for any other reason, I'm somebody that, is public that people can, whoever experienced it can reach out to, because I can't tell you how many of those conversations I've had
Yeah.
where, most of the time, those are the conversations that don't end up in something like a book, and they're not something that we follow up with, but it's like, it's Thanksgiving and I'm filing for bankruptcy.
Yeah.
What does
Yeah.
that look like? What
Yeah.
can I expect?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm moving into litigation, and I'm scared to death. What does that feel like? And so like being able to have those conversations, if for no other reason, that alone has been worth it. But the last thing I'll say is that um, it has been transformative for me because before this happened, I was very much I was I knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be humble. And I was very much charging forward, trying to build, my empire, my thing, my own way. And so that resulted in me, not properly assessing risk, not properly building a team, not really, not being honest with my wife, not really doing the things I should have been doing from the beginning. And coming out of this on the other end, I really learned the value of, there are some things I'm good at and there's some things I'm not good at. So the first thing I need to do is like I do believe that everything happens for a reason. So for me now, it's like first thing I need to do is trust that I have a place, that God has a plan for me, and I'm going to focus on that. And then beyond that, below me, I'm going to build a team of people around me who are doing things way better than I ever could.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be as open and transparent about that as possible. I'm not going to try to make things happen just out of sheer will. I'm going to, move forward with intention and try to, not make those same mistakes. And we haven't fully rebounded yet, but it definitely feels like we're on the right trajectory. So, yeah, I'm excited for what the future has to hold.
Amazing. Jed, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.